Hello and welcome to part 2. As discussed in the previous video, many reasons lie behind the placement of statues and monuments in our public spaces. We also observed many occasions where such monuments have been removed, often during events of violent destruction. These events have a symbolic significance. They come under the terms of Iconoclasm and Damnatio Memoriae. Behind all of the acts of toppling statues that were discussed in part 1 is the role played by crowds. It is the focus of this video to explore the psychology of crowds. This subject has been explored by psychologists for a long time, and there are a series of approaches. But the aim today is to present some of these theories and to try to show how psychologists might explain past examples of iconoclasm and the events of 2020 following the Black Lives Matter protests. I'd like to point out up front that I am not a psychologist, and my research on this subject has only been over the last few months. However, archaeology is an interdisciplinary field, and so bringing in the work of important psychologists to answer historical problems is not something strange, but perfectly normal. We will first turn to the work of Gustave Le Bon, a French sociologist who lived from 1841 to 1931. Le Bon studied crowd psychology and was probably the first to explore the theory behind crowd mentalities. Despite being published at the end of the 19th century, his book, The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind, is still extremely useful to this day. He was massively influenced by the historical events of contemporary France, especially the French Revolution. Le Bon argued that in order to understand the development of human history, we need to look at crowds and understand what motivated them. He defined crowds as individuals united into a group on the basis of a common belief or ideology. While this can include religion as its driving principle, we will see there is also a religious quality at the heart of all crowds, even when religion is not overtly stated as a common goal. Le Bon believed that once an individual becomes part of a crowd, he or she loses their individuality and becomes guided by the group. However, this loss of individuality also incurs a loss of creativity and originality. By sacrificing one's goals and desires to the will of the crowd, an individual loses all capacity to think for oneself. All new ideas need to come from outside the crowd. The lack of creativity means that crowds do actually need certain individuals to take a prominent position. This is why, according to Le Bon, leader figures or chiefs emerge. These are ringleader or agitator types. Emerging from, or elected to, a position of importance, these leaders or chiefs simplify the idea of the group by explaining it into simple chunks. Crowds are so hypnotized by the specific idea they follow that, as Le Bon notes, everything outside it vanishes, and that every contrary opinion appears to him an error or a superstition. It is the very despotic nature of leaders that enables them to obtain a following and take control, as this quote from Le Bon indicates. In the crowd, the individual gets swept up into a trance-like state. People in crowds lose their inhibitions, their sense of moral responsibility, and they feel invincible. They feel mesmerized, hypnotized by the leader, which can even see a type of personality cult develop. The cult of personality found in crowds shows how these groups take on an almost religious nature even when religious itself is absent, or that religion is not one of the main stated aims of the crowd. As Le Bon states, because crowds blindly submit to their guiding beliefs, because they are fiercely intolerant of alternative views and thus need violent propaganda, crowds and their beliefs have a religious form. Like religions, crowds take on an intolerant stance, and where others disagree with the ideas and beliefs held by the crowd, the mass becomes violent and extreme. As Le Bon puts it, crowds do not reason. They accept or reject ideas as a whole. They tolerate neither discussion nor contradiction. Suitably influenced, crowds are ready to sacrifice themselves for the ideal with which they have been inspired. They only entertain violent and extreme sentiments, that in their case, sympathy quickly becomes adoration, and antipathy, almost as soon as it is aroused, is transformed into hatred. These general indications furnish us already with a presentiment of the nature of the convictions of crowds. However, Le Bon's ideas are not without their problems. For example, he was influenced by evolutionary theories, especially Darwin's work, which had been published some 40 years before Le Bon's book. At the end of the 19th century, such evolutionary ideas were being used in anthropology and economics to justify the differences in wealth and technological advancements between various nations and peoples. Le Bon's ideas thus display a concern for how behaviour is shaped by one's racial origin. He believed that by becoming part of a crowd, a man regressed into barbarism and descends several rungs in the ladder of civilization. Although mainly focused on the differences between European crowds and how their racial makeup played a big factor in their behaviour, Le Bon felt that race was the most powerful of the factors capable of determining men's actions. While it is no longer accepted that races and nations conform to these predetermined stereotypes, Le Bon's ideas were a major influence on Sigmund Freud, who wrote his own book on crowd behaviour titled Massenpsychologie und Ich-Analysis. My German is not so good, so excuse the pronunciation. Anyway, this was translated into English as A Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego. This short volume was published in 1921 and clearly shows the mark of Le Bon. But first, we should mention who Freud was and why he was important for the study of crowds or groups. Freud was born in 1856 in the town of Pribor in the Czech Republic, what is now the Czech Republic, but back then it was still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and was known as Freiburg in Mähren. However, Freud spent most of his professional life in Vienna, where as a Jew he was forced to flee the Nazis in 1938 and went to Britain with his family. He died in London in 1939, a year later. Freud is probably the most famous psychologist in history. Not many others have had the same sustained and continuous impact he has had in his field. He founded the discipline of psychoanalysis, which included the development of many innovative therapeutic techniques, such as the use of free association and discovered transference. He redefined sexuality to include what he proposed were its infantile forms. This approach helped him to place his idea of the Oedipus complex at the centre of psychoanalysis, where it functioned as its guiding principle. He believed that the origin of all human drives and effects, or emotions, is the individual psyche, and in many ways this has had a lasting appeal in psychology and psychoanalysis. He is equally famous for his interpretation of dreams, and much of this is based on his theories of the unconscious. We do not have the time to discuss all of Freud's theories and ideas here. Suffice to say that his impact is immense. Returning to Freud's group psychology book, he spends his first 2 chapters summarising Le Bon's theory and pays him a series of compliments. But Freud notes that Le Bon only considers the changes occurring to an individual when he or she is in a group or crowd, rather than what common factor it is that unites the crowd to join together. Freud does agree with Le Bon, however, that groups are impulsive, changeable, and irritable, and they are led almost exclusively by the unconscious. And while they may have positive effects, they do not stop until they achieve their goals. Yet crowds or groups are characterized by a kind of madness. Freud points out that Le Bon's study maintains that the crowd or group is largely irrational, characterized by a kind of madness, and that any kind of crowd immediately places themselves under the authority of a leader or chief, whoever that individual may be, and regardless of whether they are fit to be leaders. Freud discusses Le Bon's theory that crowd leaders and the ideas they follow possess a power which he calls prestige. This power is similar to hypnosis and paralyzes the individual's ability to think independently while in the group. After praising Le Bon's work, Freud begins to point out some problems with his predecessor's theory. Firstly, he feels that Le Bon's theory of prestige is an unsatisfactory explanation for what drives the leaders of crowds, and that it has not been as well articulated as Le Bon's discussion of the mentality of the crowd, which Freud describes as brilliant. Next, Freud argues that most of what Le Bon wrote can actually be found elsewhere, in the work of earlier scholars. This is a critical comment on the originality of Le Bon's work. Essentially, he feels that Le Bon's hypotheses are little more than a descriptive picture of group psychology and do not provide us with satisfactory explanations. For Freud, only psychoanalysis can do this properly. Freud then begins to formulate his own ideas on crowds and how they form. He speculates on the spread of shared emotions, and when these become contagious, can become the group's suggestive influence. Central to Freud's new explanation of what causes crowd behaviour, then, is the concept of love, or in psychoanalysis, what is called libido. Freud believed that relationships based on love or emotional ties constitute the power which brings and holds a group together. These emotional or libidinal ties see the individual give up his or her distinctiveness and open up to the other members of the group. The kind of love that Freud is referring to is not only that of a sexual or romantic kind, but includes that of the eros described by Plato and the love the Apostle Paul described when referring to the Corinthians. To illustrate how important these libidinal ties are in forming groups, Freud examines two examples he believed had yet to be investigated: the church and the army. Both of these two groups he calls artificial groups, as they are lasting, well organised, and possess a clear structure. They also both have a supreme head figure in the form of Christ and the Commander-in-Chief, and these two symbolic figures act as a kind of substitute father for the individual members of the group. Furthermore, because every member in the group establishes an emotional tie with both the leader and the other members of the group, this explains the loss of an individual's independence and the other personality changes incurred when joining a group. All crowd members thus substitute the single father-like figure of the leader in the place of what Freud calls their ego ideal. Consequently, they revere the leader, and because this reverence is shared in identical fashion between each member, it serves to bind the group together. This leads Freud into his Oedipus complex theory, which we won't discuss here, but anyone who is interested in exploring the theory further can do a quick search, and some well-written examples are available. So to sum up Freud, before we move on to the next theory, the psychology of the crowd can be best explained by the libidinal or emotional ties each member of the crowd, or in his terminology, the group, holds with each other member, and also with the leader of the crowd. Yet there are problems with both Freud and Le Bon's understanding of crowds. As Professor Ruth Parkin-Gunelas highlighted in 2012, there is a tendency in these ideas to take the concept of the mass as a catch-all, elastic, ideological container, pulled in all directions to accommodate changing political and psychological prerequisites. This is no less the case today than it was at the beginning of the last century. It is therefore necessary to look at the context within which crowds come to exist. We will look next at two brief theories that followed on from Freud. Firstly, the concept of de-individuation. This concept followed on from Le Bon and Freud in that it viewed crowds as irrational forces which could cause an individual to lose his or her self. Because crowds provide people with anonymity, they can cause an individual to lose their identity, and this is a state of de-individuation. This sense of becoming less individual sees behaviour become impulsive, irrational, and regressive. People lose their inhibitions, largely due to the normal social and personal controls being lacking. The sense of crowds being irrational was criticised, however, by other psychologists who attempted to analyse in more depth what brought crowds together and how they could force social change. Amongst these was Serge Moscovici, who was born in 1928 and died in 2014. He was a Romanian-born French psychologist. Much of his work was focused on group psychology. He was initially interested in how knowledge can change and be reformulated from its original form when it is passed down the line. For example, we think of something like this as gossip. He wrote a book called The Age of the Crowd that explained how the 19th century view of the crowd as irrational and savage, criminal and capable of committing terrible crimes was completely wrong. This was also a product of his study of minority opinions. His 1976 book, Social Influence and Social Change, laid out his innovative conversion theory of minority influence. This theory demonstrated how the opinion of a minority could cause the majority to change their minds or opinions on a specific issue. He argued that disagreements between and within groups result in conflict, yet minorities have the power to influence opinions and cause social change. He conducted experiments where 6 participants judged the colour of a series of coloured slides. All of the slides were blue, but to different degrees of luminosity. But Moscovici deliberately placed 2 participants amongst the group of 6. These 2 were told to consistently state that the slides were green and not blue. This had the effect of eventually changing the opinion of the rest of the group, thus demonstrating the power minorities can have in changing majority opinions. 3 key components mark this theory: consistency, commitment, and flexibility. Moscovici highlighted how consistently voicing one's opinion and being committed to that point of view could cause the majority to slowly change their own views. However, he also argued that it was important the minorities were not too dogmatic. In order to gain the acceptance of the majority, the minority needed to show a degree of flexibility and that they too were willing to change something. Moving on from Moscovici, Freud and Le Bon, a more recent approach to crowd psychology is social identity theory, and the main proponent of this is the British psychologist Stephen Reicher. Incidentally, Reicher is the only psychologist discussed on this video who is still alive and working as an academic. He is a professor in the School of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. His research interests focus on the issues of group behaviour and the individual to social relationship. Of interest to us here is that he co-authored a book on the 2011 riots in London that followed the police killing of Mark Duggan. He has a long-running interest in crowds and crowd behaviour. The analysis of crowd behaviour until the 1980s had largely ignored the fact that it is an intergroup phenomenon. This is the main point that Reicher laid out in his 1987 article, Crowd Behaviour as Social Action. He argues that some form of confrontation between the group and other groups, whether physical or symbolic, takes place during the emergence of crowds. These confrontations include direct collective ones between police and rioters, for example, or rival gangs or team supporters, but also we have those of an indirect nature between the crowd and the state. Yet for Reicher, these instances of confrontation do not entail the loss of identity for members of the crowd. Instead of losing an identity, the people in the crowd assume the identity of the crowd itself, hence the term social identity theory. It is the context that gives the identity to the group, and this identity, in turn, gives the group the boundaries for its behaviour. For some groups, then, violence may be a legitimate and valid option according to their own understanding, such as for the neo-Nazis in West Germany. We need to remember here that Reicher's article was written in 1987, so that's why he's referring to West Germany. For other types of crowd, violence may not be acceptable, for example, spectators at certain types of sporting events. While these examples have norms that limit acceptable crowd behaviour, other random, spontaneous crowds do not have the same kinds of norms to indicate how their members should behave. In these situations, crowd members look to the identity-consistent behaviour of others, usually central group members, for guidance. Where individuals follow other influential members' identities and conform to those identities, this process is called self-categorization. As I said earlier, much of this theory comes from Reicher's 1987 article, which I don't have a copy of, so instead we will look at another of his articles from 2012 which reinforces his earlier work. Reicher begins by examining the classic traditional accounts of crowds, especially those by Le Bon and Freud. He highlights how these earlier understandings owe much to the perspective of an external observer, and this explains why it views crowds as mad or irrational. Furthermore, Le Bon and others rarely discuss the context from which crowds emerged. Despite writing about the class struggles of 19th century France, which included confrontations between police and workers, Le Bon fails to mention any of these social problems. As Reicher observes, this has the effect of portraying crowd anger and fighting as something that just happens, because it is in the nature of crowds to fight. This classic account of crowds thus ignores what crowds regularly rebel against, namely the repressive laws, wage cuts, police charges, and other changes that cause animosity in the social body. He points out that there are 3 reasons why the classic account of crowds has endured and why it has remained attractive to scholars. Firstly, it denies any agency to the crowd. It is merely a mad babble. Secondly, it awards the crowd a violent character by its nature and ignores any oppression it may face. Thirdly, because crowds are naturally violent, they can only be controlled through force. However, he notes some problems with this. The way it is framed tends to see the individual or the psychological subject as desocialized. Thus, Le Bon's approach is flawed because it desocializes individuals or ignores their autonomy and agency when they're in a group. This leads Reicher into his own idea of social identity theory. He feels that crowd violence is not random but reflects a clear pattern. Namely, that collective beliefs are enacted upon designated targets. He uses two examples to show how crowds are not chaotic and irrational, but actually focused and organised. The first is the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre of 1572 in France, and the second are the some 700 food riots that occurred in England between 1750 and 1820, which were studied by the historian E.P. Thompson. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre was the culmination of a long series of religious conflicts, and it led to the expulsion of Protestants from France. As Reicher notes, the bloody circumstances of this massacre seem to confirm Le Bon's ideas on crowds, if only at first glance. We can see here in Reicher's description both Catholics and Protestants subjected each other to incredible attacks of brutality. They murdered each other, violated each other's corpses, disrespected each other's religious spaces and sacred objects. However, Reicher feels that these acts, as brutal as they were not chaotic, but regulated, planned and targeted. Rather than being random, these acts were deliberate, and a clear pattern emerges to expose the heresy of the other. For the Catholics, this was focused on the body of the Protestants, while for the Protestants, this was focused on the objects of ritual the Catholics used for Mass. According to Reicher, once one looks closer at what initially seems a Le Bonian event, a different picture emerges. Using the example of food riots in 18th and 19th century Britain, Reicher argues that even less violent and bloody protests are marked by the same sense of being planned and organised. The historian E.P. Thompson observes that the food riots in Britain between 1750 and 1820 did not occur at times of food shortage, but during periods when the grain supplies were increasing. But what triggered them was the transport of grain out of the area. The reaction was not violent and bloody though. The riots saw the seizing of grain and then sold at a price then acceptable to the people, and the money and grain sacks were then often handed back to the merchants. This shows that the riots were not motivated by some desire to destroy the merchants and their wares, but by a need to respect local needs. Or, as Reicher puts it, a clash between two economies, one based on traditional rights and obligations of the local economy, and the other based on a market economy where goods are sold at the best price. However, a further important point he makes here is on crowds and leaders. Le Bon and Freud both push the idea that crowds need leaders. Yet Reicher argues that in both of the examples he cites, it is clear that crowds do not always need leaders. Therefore, crowds can act in ways that can be patterned and culturally meaningful even in the absence of formal leadership. Reicher outlines 3 types of transformations that can lead to the emergence of crowds. All 3 are integrally linked with each other. The first is cognitive transformation, which is the shift from people in crowds thinking about their personal identity to their social identity. The second is relational transformation, in that people in crowds stop defining themselves and each other as other, and instead feel solidarity and shift towards intimacy with each other. The third is affective transformation, whereby people in crowds go under a transformation and express strong emotions. These can include love, joy, hate, and anger. With this third transformation, Reicher agrees with the classic account of crowd behaviour as epitomised by Le Bon and Freud that we discussed earlier. To conclude, Reicher points out that the group cannot be understood through the idea of the unconscious nor the libido, but through the concept of social identity. Reicher's approach is interesting and offers insights into how groups can come together. We will review it again shortly, But before we do, I want to link into his third transformation, the idea of affective transformation, and to examine what may be at work in terms of biology that can lead groups to form and to experience the heightened emotional state Reicher mentions. To do this, we will turn to the work of Teresa Brennan and her book, The Transmission of Affect. Born in Australia in 1952, Teresa Brennan was Schmidt Distinguished Professor of Humanities at Florida Atlantic University. While finishing The Transmission of Affect in 2002, she was fatally hit by a car and died on the 3rd of February 2003. Her book was published posthumously in 2004 and provides us with some interesting ideas on how human emotions or feelings may be passed to other humans. She defines the transmission of affect as how the emotions or effects of one person and the enhancing or depressing energies these effects entail can enter into another person. This can be summarized by that moment when you walk into a room and feel an atmosphere. This could be grief or anger. You feel the change of atmosphere in your body in both a physical and biological sense. She aimed to understand how the feelings of individual people could be transmitted to other people merely by being in the same space. Yet affect itself is not the feelings or emotions of those people, but what allows those feelings to be produced, thus their chemical, hormonal, or pheromonal form. Our sense of smell plays a key role in enabling us to feel or sense an atmosphere, especially seeing as pheromones molecules can often be airborne. Brennan argued that the hormonal interactions behind such feelings also places us in similar emotional places, but in different roles, such as the abuser and the abused. These effects are both present inside us but also outside us. Essentially, they are social in character, but they pre-exist us. The nature of these biological references mean that when a group of people forms, the hormones can lead to either an intensification or an offsetting of psychotic effects, or in other words, increased violence and aggression or more restrained silent protest. But the hormones and pheromones we release do not simply change our behaviour. Brennan argued that they actually change us biologically in that they have a biological impact. She again gives the example of walking into a room and breathing in a particular atmosphere, in this case, anxiety. Research has tended to emphasise the visual stimuli in causing violent responses in groups. This may be seen, for example, with football hooligans who see violence and they are more likely to respond in a violent way themselves afterwards. Such thinking fits in with the classic approaches to crowds of Le Bon and Freud. However, she notes that the visual stimulus does not work on its own, but is accompanied by an increase or decrease in hormone levels. In fact, there is also evidence to indicate that individuals who deviate from the group can also be capable of resisting the turn to violence. She pointed out that science has generally ignored the role that hormones play in the transmission of affect and how research on hormones supports the realization that the environment, especially the environment in the form of other people, changes human endocrinology, not the other way round. The fact that science has tended to ignore the biological and chemical nature of affect, in her opinion, results from the erroneous idea that the biological determines the social, and that there exists a self-contained individual who acts of his own accord, and that his impulses and desires come from nowhere other than the history embodied in his genes. This is a view that derives from neo-Darwinism, and she even argues that Richard Dawkins and his idea of the meme is wrong because he insists that we are restricted by forces beyond our conscious control. She believes that this is not the case, and that instead of genes being the main line of transmission of biological change, that pheromones also play a key role in changing an individual's agency or ability to act. There is much more to Brennan's book, and I won't take this review any further here. However, her main idea that is important for us here is that in crowds, the transmission of feelings can be a result of hormones. This is a very interesting idea, and it brings together all of the theories we have discussed in this video. So now it is time to analyse how these crowd theories can help us to understand the Black Lives Matter protests occurring in the summer of 2020. First of all, I want to make it clear that I am not a psychologist and can only evaluate the theories presented here in terms of how they may help us analyse history and archaeology. So I want to leave it up to you guys to decide what you think. Please leave a comment below and say what you think about crowds and which theory you agree with the most. What do you think best explains the pulling down of statues as a result of the Black Lives Matter protests? To help, I'll just bring in a few concluding points here. We could view the BLM crowd through the eyes of Le Bon and see the crowd as a mass of individuals who, by coming together, lose their individual identity and also their sense of self-control. Led by the other crowd members, the mass loses its inhibitions, moral responsibility, and becomes intolerant to alternative views and is therefore more violent and extreme. We could look through Freud's lens and see the crowd as a product of our more baser instincts that normally are suppressed, what he called the libido. His crowd is irrational and characterized by a kind of madness and places itself under the authority of a leader or chief. Ties of love bind each member to each other and to their leader. However, both these ideas ignore the fact that the BLM protests lacked any form of leader. The crowds pulling down statues are a fragmented group, and at most the only thing we could say is anything near a leader are their ideas and beliefs which tie the group together. We could therefore look to explain how the pulling down of statues emerged, therefore its context or background. We could look to Reicher's social identity approach to see the crowd as formed around some sense of solidarity. They share the same ideas and so come together. Therefore, the aggression they produce in specific contexts may be a direct result of the oppression the crowd may face. Black Lives Matter pulled down statues, but through Reicher's view, they targeted specific and agreed targets for the iconoclasm, which included symbols of the state, symbols of power, and of history. Taking the social identity approach could enable us to see the issues the crowd shared. It could allow us to justify the issues held by the BLM protesters. Yet this approach could be taken too far. Alongside their iconoclasm, the Black Lives Matter protesters rioted and looted shops, targeted white-owned properties more than those owned by people of colour, burnt down buildings, both state buildings and local shops. They also committed assault and murder, including that of a retired black police officer. The social identity theory could be too lenient here. In its attempts to understand and explain the aggression of the crowd, it fails to condemn those cases of violent destruction. It is clearly not the case that every single member of the BLM crowd was motivated by the concept of justice. There were clearly many opportunists involved in the looting of shops, for example. Reicher's approach argues that the traditional view of crowds tends to legitimize the repression of protests through the use of state force. This seems to imply that any form of violence against the state is justified because it is always oppressive. But this is a dangerous conclusion. Is it truly the case that in democratic countries that the state is always wrong? Does random violence also not exist? Reicher doesn't fully answer these questions in my view. We could look to Brennan's work on psychology and human endocrinology. We could see the acts of iconoclasm committed by BLM as a result of our biological impulses, the pheromones in the room theory. This could be an interesting avenue to explore, but biology does not fit well with Reicher's social identity theory, so it may not be acceptable to some. It may be that a combination of all of the theories presented here allow us to understand what has really happened this summer. How does crowd psychology help us to understand what is going on and what kind of crowd is calling for the toppling of statues? Well, the protesters appear to be made up of two different subgroups, the BLM protesters and Antifa protesters. Both these groups are Marxist or anti-capitalist in scope. Their aims need to be remembered before we decide what kinds of crowds they are. There does not seem to be an easy answer to this situation. What do you guys think? Leave a comment below if you want to start a discussion. What the implications are for archaeology also needs to be considered. This leads us into our next two videos. In part 3, we will ask the experts and see what the academics, historians and archaeologists have to say about the erasure of history. We will see if they can provide us with a way forward or whether they will fall flat on their faces like the statues we've been discussing. Then in part 4, we will look into the implications that the fashion for iconoclasm has for the museums field. What role should the institutions play? Should they become more inclusive and remove what is being referred to as whiteness? Or should they be the very institutions to help us restore balance and some clarity into these crazy times? If you have enjoyed this video and what it discusses, then a like or a subscribe would be appreciated. And please leave a comment below if you think you may have an answer to all of this. Stay tuned for part 3, which is coming soon.